Good to see everyone this evening. Hope you all are all well. Started talking a little bit, kind of this introduction to David. I mean, David kind of got pulled into the scene, but now we have some things to deal with. Saul's torment by the evil spirit. We talked about that quite a bit last week. And I think that's something that is a difficult subject sometimes for us to wrap our head around. But of course, like I said, in the Old Testament, evil, Satan, is really viewed quite a bit differently than it is in the New Testament. And sometimes we kind of got to try to wrap our head around that a little bit. Saul was we've kind of made a character out of Saul, haven't we? We've kind of know his nature, who he is, kind of selfish, kind of a little bit jealous, kind of a little bit schizophrenic now, you might say, as we start to get into this period of time. He's worried about his throne. He's worried about his lineage. He's worried about being in control. He plays to kind of his own drum, doesn't he? He kind of puts God on the second burner. And then God looks for this guy after his own heart, which is David, and we got to introduce David. So we introduced Jonathan. We introduced him as a valiant warrior who loved God, put God first, kind of took control, but then we kind of pushed him to the side till we kind of get back to him. But I don't think it's important. I think it's really important how Jonathan's introduced as this strong, God-fearing, victorious individual, because I think as you go through Samuel, so as you go through the story, you kind of start to doubt maybe Jonathan's, maybe his zeal for the throne or his integrity or, what he's after, and you think, well, maybe Jonathan's not as brave and courageous, but I think the writer of Samuel wants you to see Jonathan as brave and courageous and leader and all these things that Jonathan is, and you just got to keep that in your head. When we get into David, David is introduced two different ways in Samuel. And like I said, it's really difficult. It's a chronological problem. It's a problem we deal with. Saul, when did Saul recognize him? It's one of those things when you read 1 Samuel 16 and you read 1 Samuel 17 and you get to the end of it and you're like, what's going on here, right? How does this work? So here, David is introduced. If you look at 18, David is introduced as a Bethlehemite, which we know that. We already know that he's the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. We already know that, right? But now he also is introduced. Now when we first saw David, it's when Samuel went to anoint him, right? And when he did, he was the youngest. Remember, he was out with the sheep. Samuel thought, surely this isn't the guy. At the end, he came in. He's just a youth. We don't know how old. He's just a youth, youngest of the sons. We know he's ruddy complected, and he's the one that Samuel anoints. And then we kind of drop away from that, right? Kind of drop away. But now when we come back in 18 here, at this particular point, he's now a skillful musician. He's a mighty man of valor. He's a warrior. Now, if you remember right, when Samuel anointed him, the Lord kind of came on him, right? So there's a little more here than this isn't just David at this point, right? You're going to have to really keep this in mind when we get into 17. So at this point, he's a skilled musician. He's a mighty man of valor. He's a warrior. He's prudent in speech, and he's a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. Now, we know in that society, in that time, 20 and older were considered warriors. You had to be 20 before you were a warrior. So before you could go fight, be involved in a battle. So in this time frame, Saul's tormented, right? David at this point is a young man here, not a child, right? I think we can see that in the text. And he's somebody that's well known at this point, right? So we kind of see that as we start to move through this a little bit. Oops. So then when we know that, Jesse's going to send him to Saul. He's going to send him with bread, a jug of wine, a young goat, sent them to Saul by David his son. David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So your armor bearer was the guy that carried your armor into battle. He was probably one of the person that was the closest to you. He was somebody you trusted with your life. He fought along beside you. It speaks of David's integrity. It speaks of his honor. It speaks of who he was with God. And it says, Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David now stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it came about whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, David would take the harp and play, and Saul would be refreshed and be well, and the evil spirit would depart from him. So we're all good up to this point. This all kind of makes sense. You know, here's David. David's becoming this man that God intended for David to be, the man that God saw within David when he chose him to be the king. And it seems like this is all, but now it seems like we jump back, okay, when we get into 17. And that's what makes it a little bit confusing here. And so you say, well, why do we have this anomaly or this conundrum within the text? And, that's a really good question, and people really struggle. But there's a couple things that can be going on here. And I think you have to kind of look at this in kind of multiple ways. One thing is that, at this point, we talk about David and Goliath. David obviously is younger here in 17 than he was in 16, okay? So we're not chronologically sequenced here. So we kind of had to keep that in mind in the text. Now you say, well, why? Why do we really seem to have these two introductions? We introduced Jonathan, right? We introduced Jonathan. We introduced Samuel at the beginning, right? We introduced Saul. We introduced these characters in this story, right? These are characters in the story. We're introducing them, and the writer of Samuel wants you to take away something out of the text. He wants you to take away a picture in your mind of who these people are. Okay, he's painting you a picture, right, with the text. So what happens here? Well, there's a couple of different things we could think about. One thing is we don't necessarily know that the person who wrote 1 Samuel 16 is the person who wrote 1 Samuel 17, okay? So if that's the case, then you're getting two different perspectives. You're getting two different introductions by two different authors of the text, okay? And one guy's wanting you to see David as this valiant, skillful, godly man that, God's taken in, and he's reaching his potential, and God's putting him in a place to take his place, okay? And maybe the other writer is wanting you to start a little earlier, and he's wanting you to see David's faith, David's ability, how God's with David, from a very young age. But then you have to ask the question, both times Saul doesn't recognize him, right? I mean, Saul doesn't know who he is in 16. Saul doesn't know who he is in 17. So that's really kind of confusing, because why wouldn't Saul know? Well, maybe, for one thing, if David is as young in 17 as he appears to be, and Saul kind of loses his mind in the middle, maybe Saul doesn't know him when he comes back in at a later date in 17. That's one possibility. Another possibility is simply a little bit of, I think the right word, a little bit of writer's flair, if you want to look at it that way, In other words, I'm making two different introductions to David here, right? And if they weren't written necessarily by the same individual, then it would be like me writing one and you writing, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to jive, Sometimes in Scripture, the very inconsistency of Scripture attests to its reliability. Does that make any sense? Let me put it to you this way. So you got 4 Gospels, right? We all know that. And all four Gospels don't always paint things in exactly the same way, right? I mean, if you've ever studied all the Gospels, they don't always exactly paint the same picture, right? Because why? Because it's Matthew's point of view, it's Mark's point of view, it's Luke's point of view, it's John's point of view. You see, and that's good. Because the truth is, if every one of us walked out of this building tonight and there was an accident right in front of us on the street and we each wrote it down, each one of us would write a different story, right? Because each one of us is going to pull something different away from that story. And if you ever go to court and you witness for somebody and there's 4 witnesses get up and all tell exactly the same thing, what's the judge going to do? Going to kick it out, right? Because it's just common sense. We never see things the same, ever. There's always going to be inconsistency. So that's okay. And so a lot of times when you see a different perspective or a different way in the Bible and people kind of pull that up and be like, well, that means the Bible's not true, or because we have a variant in the Bible. Well, that proves that the Bible's not true. In a lot of ways, it proves the Bible is true. So when you're talking about ancient text, which is what you're talking about in 1 Samuel, this is ancient text, right? This is a long time ago. And so we can't go back and talk to the guys who wrote this. We don't even know who wrote it. So the truth is, we got 2 different introductions to David here. We got an introduction in 16, we got an introduction in 17. 2 different stages in David's life, right? And so it's okay, all right? And maybe Saul didn't know him and when he got older in 16. Maybe that was a new experience. Maybe Saul forgot. Saul wasn't right in his mind. We don't know. But we have these 2 different accounts, 2 different time frames, 2 different places in David's life, 2 different introductions to David into who he was. And so it's one of those things that we just kind of have to think, well, maybe we don't have all the answers here. But on the other hand, I really believe, in my mind, every time I look at this text, I really believe I really believe this came from 2 different guys. I really believe 16 was written by somebody and 17 was written by somebody, and when Samuel got put together, it got put together. I really, in my mind, that's kind of what makes sense. So, and maybe you might look at that differently. You're certainly welcome to jump in here anytime and tell me what you think. But it is one of those things that when you first read it, you're like, oh, that's, doesn't make any sense. So, but when we jump back into this story, this is earlier on, okay? And there's a lot of reasons for that. One thing is we're fighting the Philistines here, right? And that's something Saul did early on, fought the Philistines. We got the Philistines. Philistines were a seafaring people, came over the Mediterranean. They weren't Semites. They were a kind of a perpetual enemy of Israel. And in this case, we've got a mighty man, right? We've got a giant here. And of course, we know this story. Y'all have heard the story 1,000 times in Bible school. I mean, we don't need to go through and talk about all this, obviously. But I think there's things you take away from it. And, there's always things about this story, I think, that I think about, wonder about. How young was David here? If you really read the text, 3 of his brothers went to fight. There's 8 brothers. 3 went to fight. David's the youngest. So we talk about his armor, Saul's armor not fitting, but that isn't really what the text says. The text says he hadn't trained in that armor. He wasn't used to that armor. It doesn't say that it didn't fit. A lot of times when we think of this story, we always think of, a lot of times in the vacation Bible school, they always try to put this great big armor on this little bitty kid like, he can't wear this because it's too big. But that's not really what the text says. The text says that he had never trained in that. Saul was a big guy, right? Saul was a big guy. But we definitely see David's faith. We see his faith. Now he's, by this time he's been anointed to be king. God's with him. I mean, like I said, there's more to David than just David in this story, and we ought to remember that. David had a lot of faith to stand up and do what David did, but David was drawing on his experience, right? He says, I've protected the sheep. I've killed things. If I can kill a bear, I can kill a lion, I can kill this giant. I mean, he wasn't going out there not knowing he couldn't do it. He had the ability, thought he had the ability to accomplish what he was doing. He picked up 5 stones, which I always thought was a little bit interesting, you know. Got a lot of faith, but I'm going to get 5. I might take more than 1, right, to get this job done. You know, Saul was impressed, obviously, here. And that's how come I think it makes the story a little more difficult. But you're like, well, Saul was so impressed with him here, and then why wouldn't he know him, you know, later on? So if you look at 14, David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul to greet his brothers. So if you kind of look at it, you kind of wonder, well, how old was he here? How old were the others? You know, were the other ones not old enough to be fighting yet? If so, that makes David younger. You know, I just don't know the answer to the question. You know, he wanted to take him this food, because they're fighting the Philistines. We know the story. You know, David, of course, goes to do it. And that's where, of course, he gets into the discussion about Goliath, how big Goliath is. You know, it's interesting in the text that he says, where he says, I think if you look here at 25, he says, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel, and it will be the king will enrich the man who kills with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. That's kind of what does that mean? Do you know what that promise is there, to be free in Israel? You know what he's promising? How would you like it not to ever have to pay any taxes on anything again in your entire life? That's what it means. People were taxed, you know. King taxed. They taxed people. Saul was bad about it. Solomon was worse. They taxed everybody. You had to pay so much to the king. You had to pay this tax. Basically, he's saying if you defeat him, then you're going to be tax exempt. You're going to make your father's house free in Israel. You're not going to have to pay any tax. So that's a really big thing, right? Going to give you his daughter, right? Of course, David's going to wind up with Saul's daughter anyway, right? And David said, what will be done, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? And the people answered, said, thus it will be done for the man who kills him. In other words, all these things are going to happen. So I think it was kind of interesting. David asked what the reward was. I think sometimes we miss that in the story. We think David just ran into the fight because David wanted to defend Israel and wanted to kill this Philistine. But it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that David said, what's in it? What's in it for the guy who does it? You know, what's the reward, right? And I think sometimes we miss that in the story. You know, was it an ulterior motive? Was that an incentive for David to stand up and do what David did? It's interesting in the text that David asks. He asks, what am I going to get? What's the guy going to get? And I think sometimes we miss that in the text, you know. We always think of David just running into the battle, running to the fray, going to defeat this Philistine, kill this uncircumcised Philistine. But I really think it's interesting that he asked this first. What's in it for me? You know, what's going to, you know. And I don't know that we should read too much into that, but I always just thought it was kind of interesting how that comes up. And it's something, you know, there's certain things, even in Vacation Bible School, we look at these stories like this, and sometimes we miss some of the nuances because we don't really want to bother a 6 or 7 or 8 year old kid with the nuances of what's going on. We want them to come away with this idea of this terrible Goliath and this victorious David and God being on the side and David making this great win, you know. We don't want to bother them with everything else that's going on in this story because there's a lot going on here. Saul's not being a king. Saul's not leading his people. Saul's not going out to fight here. Do you see that? Saul's not doing what Saul's supposed to be doing. Saul's not relying on God. God's not with these people. Do you see all this going on? You know, why is David having to go out and fight Goliath? Because Israel is not being who God wants Israel to be. Right? I mean, that's why they need a hero, because there's no heroes. David's brothers aren't going to step up and fight him. Saul, this big mighty Saul that God's supposed to be with, Saul's not going to step up and fight him. And so when you look at the text, this isn't just about David. This is about the failure of Israel. This is about the failure of their king to stand up and to do this. Day after day, this Philistine's coming out and taunting this king, and this king's not. You see? When people fail with God, when you fail with God, somebody's going to step up and take your place. They should. And a lot of times in the church, the problems we have is because we fail to step up and be the people that God wants us to be. And so somebody steps up and takes our place. And sometimes that person that steps up, you see, we have to be who God wants us to be. We have to stand the line. We have to stand in the gap. Saul should have been who God called Saul to be. God called Saul. Saul's God's king. Saul should have fought this giant, not David. So when he's introduced you to this, it's more than just David here. We're talking about the failure of a nation. And it's sad. It's sad that they fall into this state of where they're at. And, I think when you get into here, David's brother, right, he got mad at David. Why have you come down? And whom you left with the sheep? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart. You've come down in order to see the battle. Isn't it interesting, his brother's view of David? I mean, that's not our view of David, right? David was this ruddy, great guy that goes out and takes care of the sheep. But David's brother, doesn't this sound a lot like Joseph and Joseph's brothers? I mean, were they all there when Samuel anointed David to be? They were all in the room, right? I mean, they were all standing up. All the brothers came in. God said, that's not them. They were all, and Samuel said, we're not going to sit down until David comes in. And David comes in, the youngest. And Samuel anoints David with oil, said, you're going to be king of Israel. How did them other brothers? You see, isn't this a Joseph story? Isn't that exactly what happened with Joseph? Joseph had all this favor of God, and his brothers are like, we hate you for that. We hate you for that. We're going to kill you. We hate you so bad, we're going to kill you. Right? And David's brother here, he's the same way. David's brother, he sees Joseph as a threat. Or not Joseph. He sees David as a threat. And so you get this family dynamic in here that's going on. And David said, what have I done now? If you say that, it means they're on you all the time. Right? You don't say that unless somebody's on you all the time. Somebody that's on you all the time, you go, what have I done now? What are you getting on to me now for? David's home life isn't great. When his dad said, David, go take this food to your brothers, David was probably kicking rocks. I don't want to go do that. Doesn't this really sound like Joseph going to meet? Do you kind of see the parallel in this story between Joseph and David? And he says, David, he says, was it not just a question? Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing. The people answered the same thing. Why is he asking over and over what's going to be done for him? Why does he keep coming back to this? What's going to be done? What's going to be done? His brother gets mad at him. So he asks somebody else, and they answer the same thing. See how we miss that in the story? There's a point in that. There's a reason that the author of this text is reiterating. When you reiterate something perpetual over and over and over, it's because they want you to get it. They want you to get it. They want you to get it. So he's wanting. So this author, is putting this forth. David's asking repeatedly, what am I going to get? What's the person going to get that does this? I think we miss that sometimes in the text. So when we get down to this, he goes, and David said, I'm going to go do it. And Saul says, you're not able. You're a youth. So see, here we go. In 16, he was a valiant warrior. Obviously, in 17, he's not a valiant warrior, right? He's a youth here. You're a youth. And he says, this Philistine's been a warrior from his youth. But David said, listen, I've done this. You know the story. I've done this. I killed things before. I can kill this. I've killed the lion and the bear. I can kill this Philistine, right? But he also brings God into it. He said, the God who delivered that, the God who delivered me, right? The Lord who delivered me from the paw. And look at the word Lord there, right? Lord, that's the name of God right there. That's not just a generic. That's the tetragrammaton. That's God's name. The Lord who delivered me from the paw will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And so Saul sends a boy. I mean, it's just astounding, isn't it? Yeah. We're not far enough down. Yeah. Well, we get a little further down in the text here, though. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, like I said, sorry. It's there's just a lot of chronological issues. You know, as you get further into this, once again, who is this guy? You know, who is this kid? So it's mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, he was definitely tormented. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. He was definitely in a tormented state, for sure. No doubt about it. And then it says here, Saul clothed David with his armor. And then it says, David girded his sword, tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said, go with these, for I've not tested them. And David took them off. So, and I think that's really important because we always look at this in Bible classes and vacation Bible school like these things are just way too big. But apparently that's not the case. Now, if that's true, then David has to be a pretty good-sized man by now, right? Pretty good-sized youth in order to, because Saul's a big guy. So, but he took 5 stones, not one, right? But have you ever thought, so the winner of this battle, right? The winner of this battle wins the war. Isn't that kind of the story, right? If you beat me, the Philistine, then you win, right? And if this Philistine beats the Israel warrior, then the Philistines win. So basically, we've put this whole war, or this battle, we've put it on to one fight. Right? Isn't that how this plays out? So King Saul, the great King Saul, has put the whole destiny of this battle and of Israel in the hands of a boy. Because Saul's not man enough to go fight himself. See, Saul's not just sacrificing David here. I mean, it's easy to look at this story and say, why does Saul care? David goes out, gets killed. It's just a boy. Who cares, right? But that's not the fight. Saul's putting all of Israel in the hands of a boy, a youth. There you go. But still, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But Saul, what kind of king's Saul here? I mean, you know what I'm saying? He's a coward, right? And so the Philistines look, and I always think it's interesting in 42 where it gets right back to that appearance that he had when Samuel anointed him. You see that? It goes back to this youth with ruddy and handsome appearance. It goes right back to that same description. That's the same description that we had when Samuel anointed David, right? It's exactly the same thing was said. So you ask yourself, so how close in time is this to Samuel anointing him? Well, if you look at 42, you think it's got to be pretty close, right? Because it's exactly the same thing. Ruddy appearance, a youth with ruddy and handsome appearance. It's exactly the same wording we had when Samuel anointed David. So you say, well, how long had it been? How long now, had it been since Samuel anointed him till he went to fight this fight? Well, it's really fascinating that it's exactly the same picture, isn't it? Exactly the same picture, I think. Yeah, but the idea of a ruddy. Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a time difference in here, right? So, yeah. So, the Philistine taunted him. David makes his great statement, right? Defy the living God. And that you'll know, the earth may know there's a God in Israel. So David's giving God the glory for the fight after he asked all these times what he was going to get for winning the fight. But David gives God the glory. You know the story. David strikes him, kills him, cuts his head off, and then they pursue the Philistines. Now rose and pursued. Now they're going to win. Now they're going to do it. And they plundered the camps. And David took the Philistines' head, brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his weapons in his tent. Once again, it's kind of a problem here. Right? We don't know David's not from Jerusalem. David didn't leave from Jerusalem to go up and fight this Philistine, right? David left from his father's house tending the sheep, right? Didn't leave from there. Now he's going there. Now he's putting them in his tent. There's problems here, we have to kind of think about. And like I said, it's one of those stories. You read 16, you read 17, you're going to leave with some questions. There's no two ways about it because there's just some chronological anomalies within this, and it's hard to it's kind of hard to kind of put your head around it. Why is he, why does he have a tent? And I thought his weapons were it's the Philistines' weapons. Brought Jerusalem, put his weapons in his tent. Whose tent? David's tent? Wouldn't be the Philistines' tent, right? Right. No, we don't know the time frame here. Right. Right. But Jerusalem is not the city, Jerusalem. David will make Jerusalem. Jerusalem at this point in history is just a town. It's not the tabernacle. The tabernacle's in Shiloh. So, it's not in Jerusalem. So, we haven't got that far yet. So Jerusalem is not, at this particular point in the story, Jerusalem is not what Jerusalem is going to be. So there's a little bit going on there too. Anyway, I hope I didn't leave you with more questions than answers. We'll dive into this a little more next time. Yeah. Right, took the Philistines' weapons, yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. So, at this point, had he joined David's army, and did he have his own tent, and why was he in Jerusalem? And there's questions we have to talk about here. So we'll get into it. I think it's one of those things, you've read this your whole life. This is something we've all read our whole lives, and you think, well, I know it. But then when you start looking around it and looking into it, you're like, well, maybe this is a little more difficult story than what we teach 7-year-olds in vacation Bible school. There's more here than that. So sometimes it's good to go back and look and kind of pick this apart. And we'll pick it apart a little more. But thanks for your time.